Okay. All right. That's definitely different now. I'm assuming that I can be heard by those on YouTube now, as I can hear myself very loudly in this room. Okay. Well, I'm sincerely apologize for all of the difficulty and the technical difficulties that have gone on. Try to prepare for each one of those things as best as we can, but we'll go ahead and just continue in this text. So Joshua chapter 11 is where we are if you haven't heard me at all because you've been joining us on YouTube. Joshua chapter 11, we've just set the scene. This coalition of kings has come up against the Israelites, and they are more numerable, or they are as numerable as the sand of the seashores. It's a great army that's come up against them, and they're bringing horses and chariots, which are the greatest fighting machines of their day. So that's where we find ourselves now in Joshua chapter 11 as we look at verses 6 through 9. Joshua 11, 6 through 9, God's response and then the battle that follows it. It says, "Then the Lord said to Joshua, 'Do not be afraid because of them, for tomorrow at this time I will deliver all of them slain before Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire.' So Joshua and all the people of war with him came upon them suddenly by the waters of Merom and attacked them. The Lord delivered them into the hand of Israel so that they defeated them and pursued them as far as Great Sidon and Mizraphoth-Maim in the valley of Mizpah to the east, and they struck them until no survivor was left of them. Joshua did to them as the Lord had told him. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots with fire." So Joshua 11, 6 through 9 is where we're looking. And so after this coalition of kings and armies that's great has gathered up against them, God has a message for Joshua in verse 6. And that message to him is, do not be afraid because of them. I think it makes sense as a necessary message from God with this army that's pulled up against them. But the reason that God gives is because the next day, God would deliver them into the hands of Israel. And notice in verse 6 the delegation of responsibilities. I think it's kind of interesting. God will deliver them. Israel's job was to hamstring the horses and to burn the chariots. And so you see that God is the one who's going to bring the victory. Israel's there to do the cleanup. So often through Joshua, we're seeing God is the one providing victory, and the Israelites are still obedient, the Israelites are still active, but the Lord is the one who has the strength in this. And I want to take a moment just to talk about God saying, do not fear to Joshua. We've seen this a lot in this book. Do not fear, do not be dismayed. We've seen the inverse of it, be strong and courageous. I think it's important for us to know, what does God mean when he says this, and what does he not mean? What is he saying, what is he not saying? Because when God tells Joshua, do not fear in this situation, it's not as if to act as if this formidable army is really no big deal. It's not as if to act as if this danger or this army is a mirage. This is not a denial of the reality of the army or the threat and the danger that they pose. That's not what do not fear means. It doesn't mean that this is not something to be afraid of. Instead, what the point is to change the focus from that which would cause fear and turn it to the Lord. To recognize that the Lord is just as real as the threat in front of them. And to recognize that the Lord is just as present as this danger seems to them. And that he is far more powerful. That's what God is trying to get Joshua to do. So don't allow yourself, Joshua, to be overcome by fear and be rendered inactive or to be paralyzed by it. And I think that's the idea behind this phrase, do not fear, to Joshua. David and I were talking about that earlier. What if Joshua had said to God, God, I'm really not afraid of this army, but I'm not going to go fight up against them. Like that's not the goal. The goal is not to bolster or act as if something is not real as a danger or threat. The goal is to be active in the Lord and to do what he wants in spite of the recognized danger that is in front of us. And so I think you think about us and do not fear and trusting in God. The goal in that for us is not to deny the reality or to deny the threat behind that which causes us fear, or to deny the fact that fear is a real emotional response that we have. But it's rather that we're not going to allow that to incapacitate us. We're not going to allow that to paralyze us. Rather, we're going to turn our focus to the Lord and trust in him. And so I think that's the idea behind God saying this to Joshua. I think that's something that we can be helped by in this as well. So verse 8, you get the battle. And I'll tell you, the battle's kind of anticlimactic. It says in verse 8, the Lord delivered them into the hands of Israel so that they defeated them. And it's kind of crazy. You have this large buildup, this great army, these great horses and chariots, and yet they fight against the Lord, and there's not really much description there because God just defeated them. And you see so clearly the emphasis of the strength of God. Nothing can stand in his way. I think if movies were made with the way that battles with God works, they wouldn't make very much money. Because it's just not that exciting in that way. Because the fact that the Lord is the one that brings victory. We would expect this to be a strugglesome battle, but it's not for God. And so notice in verse 9 of this text, the Israelites follow through with their end of the deal. And so they hamstring the horses and they burn the chariots. And if you're like me, as you read through that text, it's kind of confusing. Why did they get rid of the horses and the chariots? Why did they have to do that? Why not just add them to their arsenal for later on? I think it's a fair question. So what I would say in response to that is that the point behind them doing this was to render these things unsuitable for further action in battle later on. And so the Israelites were not to use these horses. They were not to use these chariots. Nobody was to use these things in battle in the future. And so why is that, though? Why did God have them do that? It's kind of interesting when you read throughout the Old Testament how much horses and chariots come up throughout the Israelites' story. There's kind of this constant tension between what God decreed concerning them and what the Israelites actually did. It seems that the point that God is trying to get across is to stymie the Israelites' tendency to trust in horses and chariots instead of turning to the Lord for their deliverance. Because too often the Israelites would turn to horses and chariots instead of turning to the Lord for their deliverance. And so God decrees against this. In Deuteronomy 17, verse 16, you see God saying that their leaders, their kings, should not amass these kinds of horses or chariots for themselves. And in passages like Deuteronomy 20 in verse 1, God says, when you see these things from other armies, don't be afraid because I'm going to be with you. But so often Israel wanted to turn to foreign aid. They wanted to turn to others because they had these fancy and these technologically advanced horses and chariots that they could put their trust in. But God didn't want that for the Israelites. He wanted them to trust in him. And so just a couple of verses that deal with this and God making this distinction between these things. Isaiah 31 verse 1 says this, "Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help and rely on horses and trust in chariots because they are many and in horsemen because they are very strong. But they do not look to the Holy One of Israel nor seek the Lord." And that's so often what Israel does. They seek these other forms of strength instead of seeking the Lord. And in Proverbs chapter 21, verse 31, the horse is prepared for the day of battle, but victory belongs to the Lord. People are looking to these horses. They're looking to this technology to be what would save them, but really victory belongs to God. We've seen that constantly in Joshua. And then this last one's kind of one of my personal favorites. Psalm 20, verse 7. "Some boast in chariots and some in horses, but we will boast in the name of the Lord our God." Some find their strength. Some put their trust and their confidence in these other things. But here the psalmist is saying, not us, not me. We're putting it in the Lord. And I think that's what God is trying to guard the Israelites against in this text. And I doubt any of you, right, or myself, we are not tempted to put our trust or our boast in horses and chariots. So why even bring that up? Well, I mean, I realize that we don't look to horses and chariots for deliverance, but we are in just as much danger of seeking our own way instead of the Lord. We are in just as much danger of seeking deliverance from things that make more sense to us as opposed to trusting in God. We're in danger of emphasizing the wrong things. We turn sometimes to our wealth, to our own strength, to our own reasoning, to our military strength, to our own political party, to our nation, and we act as if we're going to find security in those things, but we don't. And it could be any number of other things. We need to recognize that deliverance comes from God. And so I think that's why God is doing this here for the Israelites. So let's go ahead and move on in this text. Joshua chapter 11, look at verses 10 through 15 with me. Joshua 11, 10 through 15. It says, "Then Joshua turned back at that time and captured Hazor and struck its king with the sword. For Hazor formerly was the head of all these kingdoms. They struck every person who was in it with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was no one left who breathed, and he burned Hazor with fire. Joshua captured all the cities of these kings and all their kings, and he struck them with the edge of the sword and utterly destroyed them, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. However, Israel did not burn any cities that stood on their mounds except Hazor alone, which Joshua burned. All the spoil of these cities and the cattle the sons of Israel took as their plunder, but they struck every man with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them. They left no one who breathed. Just as the Lord had commanded Moses his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. Joshua 11:10 through 15. So after they defeated this army like the sand of the seashore, they turned back to take those cities. And the focus here seems to be on Hazor, which was the leading city. The king of Hazor, Jabin, was the one who gathered all these armies together. And it seems like it was a really large city in Palestine. And then so what they do to Hazor is they burn it, which is not always what they did. It kind of draws a contrast in this passage to what they did with Hazor and the rest of these cities. Now, they burned Jericho, they burned Ai, and now they've done that with Hazor. But a lot of these other cities, they would take their plunder from it, and they would leave these cities, and then the Israelites would dwell in them later on. Now, was that okay? Was that a good thing? Was that a bad thing for the Israelites? Were they supposed to completely destroy the cities? Well, I think a passage like Deuteronomy 6, verse 10 is helpful for us in this. It says, "Then it shall come about when the Lord your God brings you into the land which he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you great and splendid cities which you did not build." Now, he's going to continue in that text to talk about houses which they did not build as well. I think what the indication is in that text is that God expected the Israelites to take some of these cities and to dwell in them. That was kind of part of the blessing of this land. It was kind of a turnkey land. They came in, it was ready to go because there were cities that were already established, houses that were already built. And so that's what you see the Israelites doing. They burn some of the cities, but some of them they take and they dwell in them. And when something that keeps on coming up in this section is the Israelites were doing as the Lord had commanded. It places such a strong emphasis on their trust in him and on their obedience to him. And something that I think this book is so helpful for us too, is that it helps us to make sure we don't underemphasize grace or obedience. I think so often we seem to pendulum swing between these two ideas. Grace, and that's just the most important thing, which it is. Or obedience, and that's really important, which it is. But Joshua helps us to see those things both need to be present. As we study Joshua, it is so clear that God is the one that is delivering. God's strength is being portrayed, and there's no doubt about that. This would not happen if it were not for God. It is by his grace. But as we also study Joshua, we're struck by the need for the obedience from the Israelites, by their need to follow through with what the Lord has commanded them. And so you get both of those coming to play. I think Joshua is helpful for us to see both of those things are necessary for us today. So let's go ahead and jump into the next section here, Joshua 11, 16 through 23. It says, "Thus Joshua took all that land, the hill country and all the Negev, all that land of Goshen, the lowland, the Arabah, the hill country of Israel, and its lowland, from Mount Halak that rises toward Seir, even as far as Baal-Gad in the valley of Lebanon, at the foot of Mount Hermon. And he captured all their kings and struck them down and put them to death. Joshua waged war a long time with all these kings. There was not a city which made peace with the sons of Israel, except the Hivites living in Gibeon. They took them all in battle. For it was of the Lord to harden their hearts, to meet Israel in battle, in order that he might utterly destroy them, that they might receive no mercy, but that he might destroy them just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Then Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities. There was no Anakim left in the land of the sons of Israel, only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod some remained. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel, according to their divisions by their tribes. Thus the land had rest from war. And so this last section here of chapter 11 summarizes a lot of these things for us. You get the land that they conquered and kind of a sweeping idea of all of that. And what you see in this text is that, as we read throughout these chapters, it doesn't take us very long to read it. It seems like they went from one city to the next. It's just a couple days that it took. But you see this, and I think it's in verse 18, this is a long time that these Israelites were waging war. I don't know exactly how long that was, but this wasn't a quick process. This is a prolonged thing as they campaigned to conquer the promised land. You see in verse 19, they didn't make any covenants with the people of the land except for Gibeon, which we read about last week in chapters 9 and 10. And so they didn't make that mistake twice. One interesting detail in the latter half of this, starting in verse 21, is about the Anakim. Now, the Anakim were those who were giants in the land. And you see that they destroyed the Anakim. A couple of things about that. One, we talk about Joshua showing us God fulfills his promises. In Deuteronomy chapter 9, God promised the Israelites that he would deliver the Anakim, the giants, into their hand, that he would destroy them. And so you see God fulfilling that promise here to the Israelites in this text. And I think that's just important for us. If you think about that, those giants were the ones that the previous generation had been so scared of. They're the ones that caused that previous generation not to trust in God, and yet here God, for their children, has delivered them decisively into their hands. And so another thing that you see in this is that there were some Anakim left, but only those in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod, which are kind of in the lower area near the Mediterranean Sea in Philistia, would be the area that those cities are in. And so just an interesting thing that, can you think of a giant that came from one of those cities? That would be Goliath, who comes from Gath. And you see that kind of set up here for us at the end of this chapter. All right, so that's a lot of information. One thing that's important for us to remember as we study these chapters is that God is using the Israelites as his tool to give justice and to bring about punishment on the wicked and sinful people of Canaan. That's why the Israelites are destroying them. That's why you see so much emphasis on the fact that they completely and utterly destroyed them. That's because this was a sinful people, and God was exacting judgment upon them. I think it's helpful for us to be reminded of that. So that kind of finishes out. Joshua chapter 11 is the last real battle that we read about in this section. And chapter 12, like we said, is going to be this summary. It's a summary or a list of all the kings that have been defeated by God and by the Israelites. And it's an interesting format that kind of draws the emphasis to the decisive victory of God. So let's go ahead and read the first 6 verses here. Joshua chapter 12, 1 through 6. It says this, "Now these are the kings of the land whom the sons of Israel defeated, and whose land they possessed beyond the Jordan toward the sunrise, from the valley of the Arnon as far as Mount Hermon, and all the Arabah to the east. Sihon, king of the Amorites, who lived in Heshbon, and ruled from Aroer, which is on the edge of the valley of the Arnon, both the middle of the valley and half of Gilead, even as far as the brook Jabbok, the border of the sons of Ammon, and the Arabah as far as the sea of Chinnereth toward the east, and as far as the sea of the Arabah, even the salt sea, eastward toward Beth Jeshimosh, and on the south, at the foot of the slopes of Pisgah, and the territory of Og, king of Bashan, one of the remnant of Rephaim, who lived at Ashtaroth and at Edrei, and ruled over Mount Hermon and Salakah and all Bashan, as far as the border of the Geshurites, and the Maccathites, and the half of Gilead, as far as the border of Sihon, king of Heshbon. Moses, the servant of the Lord, and all the sons of Israel defeated them. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave it to the Reubenites, and to the Gadites, and to the half-tribe of Manasseh as a possession." So we're looking at Joshua chapter 12, verses 1 through 6. So these first 6 verses deal with God's victory of the 2 kings that were east of the Jordan, the kings of the Amorites, Sihon and Og. And that land became a part of the promised land. It wasn't originally a part of that, but you see the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, the 2.5 tribes, asked Moses if they could go ahead and just occupy that land. They saw it as good land, and so they wanted that land. Moses agreed to that, God agreed to that, and so this becomes part of the land. And so it reminds us that God was victorious outside of the original boundaries of the promised land. And I think what you see in that, God is not some localized power that can only deal with things in a certain boundary. That's not the way that God is. God operates so far beyond that. The rest of Scripture helps us to see that as well. But I think it's an interesting thing that you see from these first 6 verses. So let's go ahead and move on. We'll go ahead and finish out this chapter. The rest of this is a long section. And I'll just tell you it's a little bit tedious to read because it's really repetitive. As you get this list of the rest of the kings that were inside of the normal boundaries of the promised land towards the west, that's what this is dealing with. But even though it's a little bit tedious, and even though it's extremely repetitive, I want to read through it because I think it's helpful. I think the fact that it's repetitive, it creates a strong emphasis for us while we read through it. So let's go ahead and I'll read through that. I want you to be thinking about what does this help us to see as we read through this text. Joshua chapter 12, 7 through 24. "Now these are the kings of the land whom Joshua and the sons of Israel defeated beyond the Jordan toward the west, from Baal-Gad in the valley of Lebanon, even as far as Mount Halak, which rises towards Seir. And Joshua gave it to the tribes of Israel as a possession according to their divisions, in the hill country, in the lowland, in the Arabah, on the slopes, and in the wilderness, and in the Negev, the Hittite, the Amorite, and the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Okay, now we're getting to the list that's repetitive. Look at verse 9. The king of Jericho, 1. The king of Ai, which is beside Bethel, 1. The king of Jerusalem, 1. The king of Hebron, 1. The king of Jarmuth, 1. The king of Lachish, 1. The king of Eglon, 1. The king of Gezer, 1. The king of Debir, 1. The king of Geder, 1. The king of Hormah, 1. The king of Arad, 1. The king of Libnah, 1. The king of Adullam, 1. The king of Makkedah, 1. The king of Bethel, 1. We're halfway there. The king of Tappuah, 1. The king of Hepher, 1. The king of Aphek, 1. The king of Lasharon, 1. The king of Madon, 1. The king of Hazor, 1. The king of Shimron Meron, 1. The king of Akshaph, 1. The king of Tanakh, 1. The king of Megiddo, 1. The king of Kedesh, 1. The king of Jokneam and Carmel, 1. The king of Dor and the heights of Dor, 1. The king of Goim and Gilgal, 1. And the king of Tirzah, 1. And all 31 kings. Okay, I realize that those are names of places that are not familiar to us, they're not familiar to me, and it's really repetitive as we read through that. But I'll tell you, I kind of like the way that he lists that out there. So now, verses 7 and 8, you kind of get a summary of the land, and then 9 through 16 are the kings of the south, and 17 through 24 are kings of the north. But think about the way that he lists that out there. You know, he could have just said that they defeated all the kings that were in Canaan, or we defeated 31 kings that were in Canaan. But why does he list out the victories this way, naming every single city and giving us one as we go throughout it? Well, I'll tell you, I think that it emphasizes the systematic and complete victory of God. And I really like it. I don't know what you picture, but as I read through that, I'm picturing something being tallied up. You know, God, 1. Okay, here's another one for God, 2. And so this is the picture that I have. If you can see that up on a screen next to me or beside me, you know, kind of a tally up of God versus the Canaanites, and God has 31 points, and the Canaanites have 0. And that's what you see in this text. I'm kind of a competitive person, so I tend to keep track of score and things like that, but that's what I see. God 31, the Canaanites 0. And I think, you know, just kind of joking around, and you guys had how many points? That's right, 0. You guys didn't win a single battle here. God blows his opponents out of the water. I think what we see in that is that, as we've talked about, we serve a victorious God. God is not second. God is not limited. He reigns. And that's one of our main themes as we study Joshua, the fact that salvation is of the Lord, that victory comes from God. He is a victorious God. And so that's one of our main themes. It's one of the main things that we learn about God. And so I think it's helpful for us as we see it so emphatically stated in this text. God is unstoppable. You cannot thwart the Lord. I think it's such a blessing to know about God because it's an indication of his power. And that's not something that you just get in Joshua. That's something that's continued throughout the rest of Scripture. I think it culminates in the gospel. You think about through Jesus, God defeats sin and God defeats death. You see that played out in the book of Acts. And I had a teacher one time I really appreciated the way that he went through the book of Acts. And he just listed out all of the conflict in Acts. And then we looked at who won in the end in those conflicts. Every time it was the Lord. The Lord is the one that wins. You think about the book of Revelation. David's doing a study in the book of Revelation focusing on the churches. But the book of Revelation overall is about the fact that God is going to triumph. God has triumphed over Satan and over this sinful world. It is a theme of Scripture. It is a theme here of Joshua. And I think it's something that's helpful for us. Because what that means for us is that God knows how to be victorious. God is going to be victorious. What's up to us is we choose which side we're going to be on. And I don't know about you. I do not like to be on the losing side of things. And so I think that's where we think about application for ourselves. We need to align ourselves with the Lord. And we do that by submitting ourselves to him. We need to recognize that he can be victorious in our lives. Each of us have things that we struggle with. Each of us have temptations and sins that seem to continue to crop up in our lives. And things like this remind us that God can be victorious. If we will submit ourselves to him, if we will align ourselves with him, that's what he's in the business of doing, is being victorious. And if we will turn to him in his strength, he knows how to deliver. It is possible by him. And so that's all that I had that I wanted to look at there at the end of chapter 12. This kind of finishes out the section of the battles of the Canaanites. Next, we're going to be looking at the division of the land starting in chapter 13. But the major battles at this point have been won. There's still a few more to be fought. We're going to look at some of those, even one next week in chapter 14. But the majority of the rest of this book, like we said, is going to be the division of the land and then Joshua's final exhortation to the people. I appreciate you all paying attention. I appreciate you all working through and working with me as we've looked at different things in this section, as also as we've kind of battled some technological difficulties. But as far as a recap of where we found ourselves this study in the book of Joshua, in chapter 11, you saw the victory in the north against those kings in the northern half of Palestine. It seemed like the best for last, this huge army, these great weapons, but none of it could stand against the Lord. And then you see in chapter 12 the summary of all these victories. God is victorious, and that is emphasized once again for us. So next week, like I said, we'll be looking at chapter 13 as well as chapter 14 as we look into that section of the division of the land for the Israelites. Thank you guys for joining us. Like I said, thank you for your patience with these things. I appreciate that. I hope these things are helpful for you. I hope that we can learn from God's word together. If you guys have any questions, if you have anything that you all need spiritually, you need prayers, you need somebody to talk to, you need somebody to study with, I'd love for you to reach out to me. We'd love for you to reach out to us over here at the church building. The number's up here on the screen, or myself personally, my number, my email, or message me here on Facebook. Thanks again, and God bless.